People believe that every thought that goes through their mind is who they are. That's very dangerous, and it's not the truth. You know, they think that thoughts originate in your mind. They come from you. They don't. They come from outside. They come from spiritual sources outside. And so do these psychotic voices. They're negative entities that inject thoughts into your thought stream because they're not material. They're spiritual. They're energetic. Your thoughts are energetic. Your memory's energetic. Your feelings are energetic. You are an energetic, spiritual being.
Welcome back. I'm here with Jerry Marzinsky. Jerry, welcome.
Glad to be here.
All right, let me give folks a brief background of Jerry so we can spend more time on the guts of the matter rather than focusing entirely on his background. But Jerry is a retired licensed psychotherapist with over 40 years of experience working with and studying the thought processes of psychotic and criminally insane patients in some of the most volatile psychiatric institutions in the nation. Jerry is a commercial pilot, certified scuba diver, and long-distance motorcyclist. He has held the positions of second lieutenant in the Arizona Civil Air Patrol and assistant scoutmaster. He was awarded the State of Arizona's Meritorious Service Award and the Pima College Maple Award of Teaching Abnormal Psychology. His formal academic training comprises of a BA in psychology from Temple University, a master's degree in counseling from the University of Georgia, and 2 years of study in a PhD psychology program. He is the co-author of An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind, Breaking the Spell of the Ivory Tower, and currently has a private practice in Arizona. All right, Jerry. So you spent most of your year working in mental institutions, correct?
Yeah, I've been on the front lines of mental health for the last 45 years until I went into private practice. I've worked in virtually every mental health setting there is in the United States. Mental health centers, private psychiatric hospitals, state hospitals, county hospitals, psychiatric crisis and emergency rooms. In the state prison, I spent, I think, like 18 years in the psychology department working with the criminally insane in prisons. Wow. So I've been on the front lines for 45 years. I've worked virtually every position that you could work in mental health in the United States.
Now, you focused a lot, particularly on people suffering from schizophrenia. Are there any other instances of psychosis that also are diagnosed in a particular way in the current system but may have other causes, or is it particularly schizophrenia where there's something odd going on?
Well, there's a number of different types of schizophrenia according to psychiatry. You know, there's undifferentiated schizophrenia. There's different types, but the most prevalent is paranoid schizophrenia. You know,
all right, well, let's start with that. Can you define schizophrenia for folks that don't know what it is, or more? Yeah.
What the word means really is split mind. Okay, so it's like, you know, half the mind is sane, the other half is insane. That's the technical region of it. But basically, it means out of touch with standard agreed upon reality. Okay, so what paranoid schizophrenics do is they are hearing voices that are talking to them that nobody else can hear. Now, psychiatry and the universities, the medical establishment say that these voices are hallucinations.
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Baen Books at baen.com.
Okay. And that's what I believed when I went to work. My first job was at one of the biggest psychiatric hospitals on the planet, Central State Hospital in Milledgeville, Georgia. And there were 300 buildings there. There were, I think, around 10,000 mental patients there when I got there, down from, somewhere around 20,000 10 years before. I mean, it was massive. It was a small city in and of itself. It was in the middle of central Georgia. At that time, in the 70s, you had to drive 30 miles to Macon to go to a hamburger stand. There was nothing there except that state hospital. Okay? And when I first got there, I believed what I was taught in the universities, that the voices were hallucinations. And by hallucinations, I would think they would be random. They'd be all over the place. They wouldn't make any sense. They'd be like word salad. Okay? So I came on board thinking that, with the training I had in undergraduate and graduate school. And then I noticed that a lot of these patients who were diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia were carrying on full-born conversations with their voices. I mean, it was like watching somebody talking on a telephone where you could only hear what they're saying, but you couldn't hear what the other person was saying. So that kind of struck my curiosity. It's like, well, wait a second. If these things are hallucinations, I was thinking they were word salad, that they just didn't make any sense. They were all over the place. They were just random garbage that these people were hearing that was upsetting them. But that's not what it looked like. All right.
Now, when they hear these voices, do they report audibly hearing them, or do they just hear them in their head, like you would hear your own internal voice?
Well, that's what's so cunning and dangerous about them. The vast majority of them hear them in their own head. Okay. Now, I found out later that I was experimenting the whole time I was working in these institutions. These voices sound just like the thousands of thoughts that come through their head on a regular day. Okay. Mm-hmm. There's no, when they hear a psychotic voice, for the most part, it's not like, where the voice, and it sounds very different. It sounds just like the thousands of other thoughts that go through their mind on a normal day. Only the content and the intent is very, very different. They're usually an attack against the person or somebody in the person's environment. Right? Now, one of the patterns that I first saw them run is that they are consistently and persistently negative. Okay, you would think a hallucination would be, positive, intermediate, negative, and the whole range in between, because hallucinations are random. They're all over the place. The voices were not. One of the first things I found when I started talking to schizophrenics and asking them about their voices was that the voices were consistently and persistently negative. They were negative all the time. And the very few times they were positive, it was only to get the patient's trust, and then they would turn on them later. Okay.
And what does traditional psychiatry and psychology say about the voices?
They say they're hallucinations.
And they say they're just random and no logical consistency.
In all the books that I've read, in all the years I've been through college, so I got a BA in psychology, I got a master's degree in counseling, I spent 2 years in a PhD program, and never did they go into the details about what these voices were telling these people.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
They would just say they're persecutory hallucinations. But if they're running patterns, they can't be hallucinations. Now, one of the first patterns I spotted was that they were consistently negative. The first question I had was, what holds them on a negative trajectory? What force holds them? What force stops them from being random like all other hallucinations? There's something holding them on a negative trajectory. Okay? So that was the first pattern I saw. And it wasn't easy talking to paranoid schizophrenics. They don't call them paranoid schizophrenics for nothing. They're paranoid. You know?
Well, I mean, yeah, if you were hearing voices that seemed real to you, of course you would be paranoid. It's a human reaction.
And the other thing is there is no positive outcome for a schizophrenic to tell anybody about their voices. Okay, they tell their friends, and their friends go, well, I'm hearing these voices that are telling me to kill myself and do all these weird things and da 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 da. The first thing they do is lose their friends. Their friends go, well, you're possessed, you're crazy, and they back away. Okay, so that there is no benefit for them to tell. So they tell their parents if they're kids, and the kids drag them to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist diagnoses them as mentally ill, says they're schizophrenic, says you have to take these horrible medications for the rest of your life. There is no other treatment. And those medications are awful. They're actually toxic. They actually, with long-term use, destroy the brain. So that's one of the things they found with long-term state hospital patients is that their brains were shrunk like walnuts. And when the researchers found that through autopsies, they published it, and the psychiatric mafia and big pharma went nuts. They go, "Oh no, it's not our drugs. It's not our drugs. It's the schizophrenia doing this stuff. The schizophrenia did it." And the researchers went, "Well, no, it doesn't look like that to us." And they started feeding these phenothiazines
To
rats and monkeys, and their brains were shrunk also. So with long-term use, a lot of these antipsychotics do permanent neurological damage. And they won't tell you that.
Right, because they have a nice revenue stream for your lifespan, basically.
Well, the revenue stream for antipsychotic drugs is $7.4 billion a year. And they don't cure anything. They don't cure anything. They're merely treating symptoms. They just tamp down.
Right, they just tamp down the symptoms.
Right.
Just like about every drug that is out there. It doesn't address the root cause. And I'm sure there are exceptions, but anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, so, when I first got to this huge psychiatric hospital, that's one of the first things I noticed. Wait a second, these things aren't random. These things are carrying on coherent, meaningful conversations with these patients. Right? So none of the staff were interested, none of them. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of staff there. None of them were interested in what those voices were telling these patients. They were taught in college, they were taught in medical school, they were taught in graduate school that they were hallucinations. They just bought that hook, line, and sinker, and they just weren't curious about anything. But what I noticed
But isn't it worse than that? Isn't it worse? Don't they tell them that if you try to ask questions about it with the patients that you're somehow making their condition worse because you're deluding them? So if you continue.
That happened to me twice while I was working at that state hospital. Is one of the patients, the voices didn't like the questions I was asking. So he got the patient to go complain to the psychiatrist that I was upsetting him with the questions I was asking about his voices. Next morning, I got called up to the psychiatrist's office and ordered to stop asking questions about the voices because they were hallucinations. And by asking questions about them, I was supposedly reinforcing the hallucinations and making the patients worse. Now, that was a crock of bull. I knew that at the time, but you can't talk back to psychiatrists. Most of them are as arrogant as the day is long. It's their way or the highway, and they're the ones that control things in the institutions. So that happened twice. Psychiatry doesn't want us asking questions about what those voices are, and they're not asking them themselves, right? Nobody at that hospital, the hundreds of staff, nobody I saw was interested in what these voices were telling these patients. And one thing I saw clearly was that there was a correspondence between how these people were acting, how bizarre they were getting, how dangerous they were getting, how upset they were getting, and how often they were listening to their voices. So if they're listening to the voices and the voices are telling them or somehow getting to them to act in a self-destructive way, they either attempt suicide or at the time, what I was working for was the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. So what we were trying to do was get these people, the highest functioning in the hospital, stabilized on their meds, train them in a low-level job, housekeeping or auto mechanics, basically, or hairdressing or something like that, and get them out of the hospital working. Okay. Now, the only treatment we really had at that time were the psychiatric drugs. That's the only thing that worked, because counseling bounced off them like BBs off a rhino's butt. Regular counseling was worthless. It just didn't work at all. So they had to stay on their medications. And what I saw is the ones who were hearing voices that were on their medications, as they came close to succeeding at virtually anything, their classes, a test, or anything, they would stop taking their medicines and they would just go nuts. All right. So the voices were sabotaging whatever they were trying to do that was positive. Okay. That was real clear. And we had a rule that if they went off their meds 3 times while in the hospital, while they're being handed to them, they're certainly not going to go out of their way to get these medications with horrible, horrible side effects on their own when they get out. Right. And so if they didn't stay on those medications, they would be discharged from our program. Okay. Now, what psychiatry would tell them is that, okay, you're schizophrenic, you're mentally ill, you're going to stay that way for the rest of your life. There's nothing you can do except take these medications. So it's like they offered them no other choice. And we knew no other choice at the time. Right? So I had to really tone down the asking schizophrenics about their voices while I was at the state hospital, because there was an unwritten rule. See, psychiatrists were getting beat up at a level higher than any other staff except attendant staff who were with psychiatric patients 24 hours a day. Back then we didn't have cell phones. They were still connected to wires. Yeah, back in the 70s, but it didn't.
The phone rings, right?
It was basically phone with a wire. That was it. Cell phones hadn't come out yet. So the Grapevine was the hospital cafeteria, which was a factory. It was a food factory. They called it the food factory. It provided food for all these 200 units out there. Okay. So staff would meet there at lunchtime, and that's where, the Grapevine would, what's happening in all these different units and who got beat up and what happened. Psychiatrists were getting beat up, time after time after time at a rate higher than psychiatric nurses, psychologists, regular nurses, regular
So for
doctors.
people watching this, when you say beat up, you don't mean like they're
physically assaulted.
Physically assaulted, right. It's not like they were getting flack from their superiors, like they were physically beat up.
They were being physically beaten by their patients. And one thing I couldn't figure out back then was, a psychiatrist might be assigned a unit with 300 patients, all right? So he might be able to see one patient a month for 15, 20 minutes. Okay? So the question I had is, what is a psychiatrist doing or saying to these patients that is causing such a frequent assault rate? They're only spending 15, 20 minutes with them. What are they doing in that 15, 20 minutes to get attacked?
Were there certain psychiatrists who got beaten more than others?
Yes, the more arrogant ones were beaten more than others. The ones who were polite and were kind of toned down and somewhat not so jaded, they got assaulted less. It was the arrogant ones.
Okay, so there's no. That's just normal human kind of. That makes sense.
So they were beaten more. Some of the other ones were assaulted also, but not as much as the arrogant ones. Yeah. So I couldn't figure that. It took me 7 years to figure out what was going on there. Okay. Toward the end of the time that I was ready to leave that state hospital and go back into a PhD program, we had one female client who was doing well in cosmetology, making good grades while she stayed on her medicine. Right. She went off her medicine for a third time, which meant that technically we were going to discharge her. Okay? So I called her mother, said, listen, she's gone off her meds again. were planning her discharge, and the mother virtually begged me, please don't do that. I can't handle her here. I can't deal with her. I'll come up there and we'll find out why she went off her meds. Because when you ask them, why did you go off your medications? Their normal response is the side effects. And the side effects are horrible. This pages of nasty side effects to these drugs because they are toxic. They're not good for you. They're not good for your body. They're not good for your mind. They're just tamping down symptoms. So I agreed to speak to the mother. She came up one Friday afternoon. I had to drive a long way. And she came to my office. We brought the patient in, and both me and the mother are sitting there. This was after 7 years at that state hospital. And both of us had the same question on our mind. Why did you go off your meds for a third time when you knew you were going to be discharged from the program if you did that? Okay. And her first response was, well, the side effects. Okay, well, we knew about the side effects. We dealt with them before. There's some other drugs they can give to kind of lessen the side effects, and she had them. And I said, well, we already dealt with that before. You're given Cogentin to help you with these side effects. You were doing well, and then all of a sudden you quit your drugs again. Why did that happen? Why did you do that? And her mother's on her too, begging, why did you do that? Tell us why you did that. And she said, you won't believe me. I said, try me. I've heard a lot of crazy stuff here from a lot of different people. Tell me why you went off your meds for a third time when you knew you were going to be discharged if you did that. She said, the voices told me that the psychiatrist was poisoning me, and they were telling me that all the side effects were the effects of being poisoned, which was true. Mm-hmm. I mean, in reality, that was true. Those side effects are toxic reactions to those medications. So here the voices are telling the patients, and that's not the first time I heard that from schizophrenic patients, that they were being poisoned by their psychiatrist. That explained the assault rate. The voices were telling these patients to beat up the psychiatrist because the psychiatrist was poisoning them.
Hence the more arrogant ones got the bigger beatings, basically.
Got the bigger beatings, yeah.
Wow.
But back to the beginning, nobody was asking these patients what these voices were saying. Okay? And like I said, there was no...
Other than you, is there anybody asking today what these voices are saying?
No, not that I saw. Not any of the places that I worked. They all believe that they're hallucinations because that's what they've been told. Okay? But the longer I stayed there, the more patterns started coming out. Okay? So it took me about a year, 2 years to learn how to talk to schizophrenics where they trusted me, because they didn't trust psychologists or counselors because we were basically snitches for psychiatry. We'd watch these patients, we'd talk to them, and if it looked like they were going off their meds or they were getting worse, we'd turn them into psychiatry, and psychiatry would drug them more. Okay? So they didn't trust any of us. So it was hard to really get them to talk about what was going on because they were afraid that we would snitch them off and psychiatry would increase their meds even more and turn them into dribbling zombies, which a lot of them were pretty close to that, especially in the outlying units. So what I'd find is piece by piece, one patient would tell me something about the voices and I'd note it down, and then I'd start asking all the rest. Have you experienced this also? So when I had a consensus, I'd go, okay, we got something here. Okay. And that would go on and on and on. And I was constantly asking, but I had to be careful about how far I pushed it while I was at the state hospital to not upset them. So it was really like driving with my brakes on. I wanted to ask them tons of questions, but I couldn't. I had to really slow down the pace. So negativity was the first facet I found with the voices. They're consistently, persistently negative. And it reminded me of that movie, Run Silent, Run Deep, where the destroyer was chasing a U-boat. And every time it lost the U-boat would turn onto a specific course to go back to France. So when the destroyer lost it, the captain would turn back onto that course again and pick it up again. Okay? So here, these voices are running this particular pattern, negativity, consistent, a common trait. consistently negative. The voices were derogatory, insulting, abusive, destructive. They might have played like they were helpers at first, but once they got the patient's trust, then they would turn on them. And they were like constantly attacking them, calling them names, telling them they're worthless, they're no good, they're stupid, they're ugly, nobody likes them. Every rotten thing that you could say about a person, these voices were saying to these schizophrenics. And it was a persistent pattern. The next persistent pattern that showed up was that they were anti-religious. So I first noticed that when at the psychiatric rehab center where I worked, the preacher would have these ice cream socials where, they'd get the patient population down into this big auditorium, and they'd have cake and ice cream, and he would do a sermon, and then they would socialize and dance and play music. All right. I noticed that the schizophrenics on my ward never went down to those ice cream socials with the preacher. I noticed that the first time, and I said, well, that's pretty odd. All of them, all the schizophrenics are laying in their beds. They're not down there with the preacher, the ice cream social, So the first time I went, well, that's odd. I just noticed it. The second time I saw it, it happened again. The same ones were laying in their bed in the dingy ward rather than going down there, and ice cream and cake was hard to come by. So I started asking him questions. Well, how come you're not down there with the preacher and dancing and listening to music, eating cake and ice cream? I don't like preachers. There is no God. That's a bunch of crap. They were totally anti-religious. Okay? They wanted nothing to do with religion, the preacher, the Bible, nothing like that. And if you look at their bedstands, on their bedstands were murder mysteries, war stories, all kinds of negative garbage that they were reading. Right. And that was a persistent pattern too. They were constantly reading negative, nasty stuff. And then one day I had one patient come in and say, well, I prayed the 23rd Psalm when the voices were talking to him, and he said they went nuts. They couldn't stand it. He said they reacted like worms thrown on a hot frying pan. And I went, well, that's interesting. In association with what I was seeing on the ward, these people not going down there. So I started asking all the schizophrenics on my ward, like, what happens when you try to go to church? What happens when you pray? What happens when you try to read the Bible? And there was a consistent negative reaction on the part of the voices. So I did a survey, and out of all the schizophrenics that kept coming in, there was no lack of schizophrenics. I mean, I had access to plenty of them. And I'd ask them, what happened? What do the voices do when you go to church? And what I found, there were three categories. If the voices were weak, they would shut up when the patient went into church. They would just shut up. If they were of moderate strength, they would get louder. They'd start mocking the preacher. They'd start mocking what he was saying. They'd start interfering so the person couldn't hear the message that the preacher was trying to say. They would just become annoying and get louder. And if the voices were very strong, the patient would jump up and actually run out of the church. So I've seen that once where the person just, ran to the aisle and then ran out of the church. So I started asking questions and handing out the 23rd Psalm and saying, okay, what kind of reaction do you get to this? And it was consistent. The voices absolutely hated the 23rd Psalm. They hated it when people read the Bible. Now, what kind of hallucination would care about the Bible?
It's weird.
It's another pattern that just didn't make sense. And this was a persistent, consistent pattern.
Is there anything, have you tried other religious scriptures like?
Oh, yeah. The Muslims
the Quran,
are big on this. Yep.
The
Quran.
Book of Mormon, so it works for any religious tradition, basically.
Yeah, I haven't tried the Book of Mormon, but the Arabs with their Quran, they are much more aware of these entities than Christians are. They have specific prayers to pray against them. They're very aware that they exist, and they're very aware that they're whispering things in people's ears. So normally what's running through your mind on a normal day? You got thousands of thoughts running through there, blah, 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 blah. It's telling you stuff you already know, judging, all this garbage. It's a constant. It's a constant verbiage. Okay. If that's who you really are, then who is listening to all that garbage?
Yeah.
That's not who you are. See, people believe that every thought that goes through their mind is who they are. That's very dangerous. And it's not the truth. They think that thoughts originate in your mind. They come from you. They don't. They come from outside. They come from spiritual sources outside. And so do these psychotic voices. They're negative entities that inject thoughts into your thought stream because they're not material. They're spiritual. They're energetic. Your thoughts are energetic. Your memory's energetic. Your feelings are energetic. You are an energetic spiritual being. If that energy left your body would die and deteriorate. You are not a body. Your body's a spacesuit that you're walking around in on this planet. So your spirit is like driving the car. And here's psychology and psychiatry that have completely bowed out of spiritual because psychology, for one, can't study it. So you can't see spirit, you can't touch it, you can't smell it, you can't feel it. There's no physical attributes to it. So they go, well, how do we study something we can't see and measure and da. So they just hit the ejection seat and go, well, okay, we'll study behavior. But where does behavior come from? It comes from
They're
thought.
studying the symptoms and not the root cause, basically.
Yeah, they're studying the symptoms, the results, and not the root cause, right? So they're not dealing with what's past that. And psychiatry is even worse because they're totally in the physical world. They're drugging the physical brain. They're drugging the physical nervous system. They're not curing anything with those drugs. They're merely treating symptoms. Yeah. Nobody's being cured. If you actually look at the results of what they're getting, in the United States right now, there are more psychologists, there's more psychiatrists, there's more psychiatric medicines than at any time in human history. And yet, 50,000 people in the U.S. are killing themselves every single year. Most of them on one or more of these drugs. Right? It's estimated that there are 24 million schizophrenics worldwide and more than 3 million in the United States. The CDC reports 132 people in the U.S. kill themselves every day. Most of them are on these psychiatric drugs. And a lot of these suicides, the patient's doing okay until they start taking these psychiatric drugs. And then they attack, and a lot of these mass murderers are on antidepressant drugs. Okay? So these suicide rates are increasing. Between 2000 and 2018, the suicide rate increased 37%. It's estimated 24 veterans are killing themselves every day in the U.S. 10,000 Americans are diagnosed with schizophrenia yearly. And it's one of the top 10 mental health problems on the planet. And what did the CDC do? They reduced the money for research into schizophrenia down to a dribble. They do not want a cure. They want to keep selling their antipsychotic drugs, which they're making, over $7 billion a year selling these drugs that don't cure anything. They just merely tamp down symptoms. So that's an overview of what the Western mental health system is doing. It's not working. It's a miserable failure. It's an absolutely abject, miserable failure. They're attributing the wrong cause to schizophrenia. They're treating physical symptoms, and they're not getting at the cause whatsoever. Right? So I got like 23 different patterns that these voices run. Now, when you look at what the psychiatric mafia and big pharma have done,
by the way, I want to interject one thing. It's just in terms of sharing with the audience. So we had another guest on recently, Dr. Thigpen. He's a theological scholar. He's written a lot of stuff on demonology, but as well as Catholic response to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, things like that. But one thing that he did note is, like you said, in terms of the explosion in the number of psychologists and psychiatrists to treat these issues, there's also been a dramatic increase in the rite of exorcism in the Catholic Church. In fact, it's happening so often that they're opening training centers. It used to be traditionally you would go to Rome and train, and now they're opening centers in the United States in order to handle the overflow. So I don't think these things are uncorrelated. Let's just say I think they're highly correlated to each other. Now, whether or not it's the same thing, I don't know, but I think there's something to that.
Yes, it's virtually the same thing. Now, with the exorcism, now it said in the Bible that once you get rid of one of these things and the house is clean, okay, that evil spirit goes out and it looks for another place to live. And if it comes back and it finds the house empty and the person has not got on a spiritual path, it will bring back 7 more demons with it to make it worse. And I have seen that happen time after time after time. So I wonder about the long-term effects of exorcism. So the exorcist can drive these things out, but if they can't get the person to get on a positive spiritual path and stay there, they will come back. And they'll come back worse and stronger.
How do you know about the number that will come back? Like, where
I don't know a specific number, but the ones I've talked to who we got rid of the voices. I mean, there's ways to get rid of them. It takes some work.
Mm-hmm.
And, release the guy, and then he comes back into the hospital a few months later, and now he's got more voices than he had before. He didn't continue on a spiritual path that we told him about. That happened a handful of times, enough to kind of validate what the Bible was saying, as far as I was concerned. Now, I don't know if
you didn't start out as like a religious guy either, right?
No.
Or you did. Yeah.
No.
So you're just
I wasn't
relaying the evidence, right?
Yeah, I wasn't an atheist,
Right.
but I wasn't a Bible thumper either. I was kind of like, okay, yeah, God exists. I mean, there's got to be a God. Look at all this stuff going on. I mean, there's, the way everything is coordinated and plants grow and how the body works. And I mean, there's got to be something in charge of all that. But I wasn't a Bible thumper. I was coming at it from the other side. And, kind of going, well, if these demons exist, then there's got to be a God also. Because it's a dualistic universe. There's light and dark, heat and cold, black and white.
Yeah, otherwise you wouldn't learn anything. You wouldn't know what light is, and if there weren't any darkness.
Unless there was
right?
darkness, right? Exactly.
So, what types of people? I mean, is there a certain type of person that would attract these things, or that these things would congregate toward, or was it just completely random?
Well, sometimes it's random, but what I've seen is horrible physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. That kind of abuse attracts them. And you look at what's happening right now with the massive sexual human trafficking, the child abuse and molestation. I mean, it's epidemic right now. And the U.S. government is complicit in one of the biggest human trafficking scandals on the planet right now, because all these women and children are just disappearing. All they have to have is an address to send a child somewhere. You can bet your booties that the vast majority of these children coming across the border are being trafficked. They're disappearing. They've lost their whereabouts. They have no idea where they are. That causes incredible amount of damage. And it's damage that lasts a lifetime. And traditional therapy usually doesn't touch it. All right. That's number one. Number two is meth, amphetamine. Amphetamine will open you up to these demonic influences at a rate faster than any other drug I've ever seen, with cocaine being second. Right?
And why is that?
I don't know. The prisoners called amphetamine the devil's drug. That's what they named it. And the way it happens is when somebody, and a lot of times psychiatrists are giving amphetamine, Ritalin and Adderall to young kids. And the prison is full of meth addicts, full of them. And a lot of them started off on these drugs, okay, when they were young. And then they started increasing. And I'd ask the prisoner, I said, well, you started off on Ritalin and you were doing well. You were able to concentrate. It kind of slowed you down. Why did you keep increasing it? They said, I don't know. That was their answer. I don't know. Yeah. But what happens with the meth addicts is they start using that stuff. They feel like Superman. They stay up. They can get all kinds of stuff done. They can concentrate better than they ever did. They feel like Superman, and they keep using it. And then they start hearing the voices, and they go, "Oh yeah, that's just a hallucination," and it appears like that. So they hear it, and then they come down, and it goes away. Right? And that may happen 15, 20, 25, 100 times. And then one day, it doesn't go away. And they're hearing these voices in their head telling them rotten things about themselves and everybody else, mocking them, cajoling them, just constantly harassing them, not letting them sleep, not letting them think, not letting them concentrate. And they're just as psychotic as a patient who got psychotic some other way. It's permanent. It does not go away. And now they have to take antipsychotic drugs.
Are there other methods for getting it to go away permanently?
Well, yeah, there are. There's a number of methods to kind of start. See, these things are negative entities. So the third characteristic they had is they create and foster negative emotion. They want to generate negative emotional energy. And then what you'll find, those of you working with schizophrenics, ask them what these patterns are, the operational definition of the voices that schizophrenics hear. Right? So when psychiatry first came out and goes, well, we don't know what the cause of schizophrenia is, they had to drum something up so they didn't look stupid. So back in the 50s, they were blaming mothers. They were saying, oh, the mothers did something to these people, these kids, and made them schizophrenic. The mothers went, wait a minute, we didn't do anything. What did we do? What did we do? So that was observable. They needed something that wasn't observable. Right. So what they did is they went and they, again, fabricated something that had no basis whatsoever. And that was the genetic theory. Oh, it's the genes. Because it looks like it follows the family. It's got to be genetic. So like the Egyptian priests of old, they go, we hereby declare that schizophrenia is caused by genetic abnormalities. Right? They had no evidence for it. Yeah, they just said it. But who's going to stand in the face of that? Who's going to stand up to them on that? It's only a very small number of geneticists who could do that. So what they've done there is they wiped out all psychiatrists, they wiped out all psychologists, they wiped out all nurses, virtually the entire medical field who could not disprove what they were pronouncing. And it stayed that way for years until a small group of geneticists became interested in this and said, wait a minute, we don't see any genetic markers for schizophrenia. There's nothing there. Yeah. So they came back and they went, well, it's not just a single genetic gene. It's hundreds of genes all tangled together, and we'll never understand it, but we know it's the genes. Yeah. And the geneticist is going, no, we don't see anything there. So that one was dropped out. So here they are back again going, well, they don't have a cause for schizophrenia. So they had to make up another one. This one was made up by Eli Lilly in the 70s when they came up with Prozac. They go, oh, well, Prozac affects the serotonin in the body and it kind of calms the person down. So schizophrenia and all mental illness must be a chemical imbalance of some kind. Yeah. So here they are. The high priest going, we hereby pronounce this as a chemical imbalance. That's what causes mental illness. They had no proof. Didn't matter to them. They wanted the money. They wanted to sell those drugs. So what I saw when I went to work at the state hospital was, okay, if there's a chemical imbalance that causes schizophrenia, because that's what I believe, because that's what I was taught. Mm-hmm. I was taught that in graduate school also. But what I saw didn't match that. When I was with psychiatrists who were evaluating and prescribing antipsychotic medications or antidepressant medications for patients, I never saw them give any kind of blood test, any kind of EEG, EKG, no kind of objective test whatsoever to determine what was out of balance or how much. So I think there's something like 23 different neurotransmitters in the brain. How do they know which ones are out of balance or by how much?
Well, do they know? Have they done studies to indicate that there's an imbalance?
No, they have no idea.
Seriously? That's just a saying? That's
they
literally just
they
a
just
saying?
arrogant. Yep. They just arrogantly, Eli Lilly started it. And then the universities, Big Pharma picked it up. Big Pharma owns the universities. The universities will put out whatever Big Pharma asks them to put out. They will teach whatever Big Pharma tells them, or the Big Pharma will cut off their grants and their money. Big Pharma also owns the journals. They can't publish anything in journals that Big Pharma doesn't agree with. And the ones that do, they're risking their jobs. So these geneticists who ruled out this genetic theory, thank God there's some honest people in these fields. But what psychiatry did is they just, like the Egyptian priests of old, they just got up and go, we're psychiatry and we hereby declare that this is a biochemical imbalance, because Eli Lilly says so. And then they started teaching that as if it were the gospel. There is not one single objective test to measure the chemical balance of the brain. They don't even know what the chemical balance of the brain should be, let alone what's out of balance or by how much at all. It's a sham. So it's a complete
You're telling
sham.
me they don't even have a baseline of what is a
They have no baseline.
Brain.
No.
Like the right percentages of certain neurotransmitters at any given set of time.
Nope. They have no idea. It's a sham they perpetuated on the public.
So there's one thing you mentioned that was intriguing and that spurred something else that was disturbing. It's going to be disturbing for the audience too. Not that disturbing, but might explain some things. So you mentioned that meth was kind of the drug of choice. For folks who don't know, during World War II, the Wehrmacht, which is the German army, was fueled by a drug called Pervitin in order to keep them up all night to march, survive in negative 50-degree weather in the Soviet Union, fighting in winter and things like that. And in fact, the author, Heinrich Boll, has like a comment where he writes a letter home. He's like, can you send more of those pills back to me? They're really helpful, right? But Pervitin was just the marketing name for methamphetamine. And methamphetamine is what fueled the German army's advance across Europe. What's scary about that is, as more and more of these soldiers got addicted to this stuff, were they seeing things? Were they committing more atrocities because they were hearing voices? Was it so dark that it just made whatever had started 10 times worse? So anyway, I think have you, not that you were prepared to talk about any of this, but have you heard any stories like that?
Yeah.
Oh, you're going to tell? I had no idea. Like, I'd be curious to hear.
Yeah, they were fueled by, matter of fact, Hitler was being injected with amphetamine under the auspices of being a vitamin.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why he got so crazy toward the end and started shaking and making really bad decisions.
So, all right, so you have this drug thing that makes, and I think in the example that you shared with me before the interview, I think the woman would say that, I think somebody you asked about using methamphetamine, apparently they didn't hear the voices while they were on the drug, but they would come back twice as strong when they kind of, during the withdrawal process.
Well, what they do, they hear them while they're on the drug. They determine that it must be a hallucination. And then when they come down from the drug, the voices disappear. Okay. Mm-hmm. So it looks like it is a temporary hallucination. Next time they do it, they hear the voices again. They come down, it goes. That may happen 15, 20, 100 times. And then one day they don't go away. They're there permanently.
And what do you think is causing this in terms of, I think I asked you earlier, the type of people that would get this or that would be targeted. Is there a type? I mean, you said, you kind of mentioned that people who had trauma, right?
Yep, there's three kinds. Number one, intense physical, emotional, sexual abuse. One, that opens them up. I mean, it does a horrendous amount of damage to these people, right? Except for the new MACE therapy method that's just recently come out, which is an energetic therapy that handles that kind of stuff. None of these other therapies do a decent job at getting rid of that trauma. Okay? And the establishment wants nothing to do with this MACE energetic method. They want to keep going with the garbage they got.
What's the MACE energetic method? Can you describe what that is?
What that is a new energetic therapy that was invented not by a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a social worker or anybody in the field. It was invented by a guy who was a virtual genius, and he was a ship captain in Australia. And in his entire life, he was curious about how the mind works. Okay? And he just kept reading and studying and reading and experimenting and until finally he found that the mind doesn't work the way that they think it does. The actual mind, all it does is takes pictures of where you put your attention. It's the spirit that does the rest. It's the spirit that sees, hears, tastes, feels, So the spirit leaves your body, all your senses go with it. So it's the spirit that does that. Okay? And he found that there was a fourth part. So what the establishment will teach you is that the human being is composed of body, mind, and spirit. And John Mace found that there was a fourth part that if not taken into account, that nothing will happen in psychotherapy. And that's the identity. Now, there are two kinds of identities. There's a positive identity that the person creates on their own, on purpose, to help them survive on this planet. The other kind of identity is a negative identity that happens during a trauma. Okay? So during a trauma, all your attention is focused on you. Okay? Something bad is happening to you. And you're focused on that. You're focused on the horrible feeling that's resulting from that trauma. So those two things are going on. Okay? That horrible feeling does not go away. It's like torturous. So the ego finally comes in and goes, hey, I'll handle this for you. And it takes it and buries it in the subconscious mind and then locks it down. But it's buried alive in there. Okay? So from that point on, it acts like a computer virus in the back of your mind. It's still alive. It's still running. It's affecting your behavior, how you think, the decisions you made, what you say, what you don't say, who you react to, and how you react to them. And the way it feels is like, say you were abused by this certain kind of guy, okay? And a really bad traumatic experience with this guy. And the ego takes that and buries it, locks it down. Every time somebody like that appears in your psychological sphere, this thing starts reacting. It goes, hey, that's the kind of guy who did this thing to you. You need to either beat him up or mock him or avoid him or get away from him. So you're given those choices. And that happens. It's like the person you hate that's constantly following you around. Now, the universe will continue to send you those kind of people to say, hey, you got something wrong there. Something's going on there. You need to fix it. Why do you keep going off on these kind of people? You're going to get in trouble, especially if they're a boss or somebody like that. You need to fix it, but you don't know how to fix it because it's buried and it's unconscious. All right. So the other thing is, one of the biggest things Mace struggled with was, where does the spirit bury this stuff in the subconscious? Could be anywhere in there. So what's so interesting about the Mace energy method is it takes the spirit into account. Not like any of these other psychiatrist stuff or psychology stuff. I mean, it actually takes the spirit into account. Right? The spirit knows where that stuff is buried. Okay? And through the use of an image, okay? So you ask the person to form an image of the feeling they had during that trauma. That image is the location to where that trauma is buried. Okay? Otherwise, you'd never find it. And the spirit knows.
That's very much like remote viewing, actually. It's very much like remote viewing.
Well, yeah, it's kind of. But the spirit is in charge. So, and it's also the spirit that drains it. Okay? So it's like hooking up a garden hose to a swimming pool and going, okay, now we're going to release the water. Okay. And that's done through the image. So as the image vanishes, that trauma, that energy from that trauma also vanishes. And it works kind of like a car battery. You can get a brand new car battery. You can charge it full, drain it down till there's absolutely no electricity left in it at all, and you won't be able to recharge it again. It won't recharge. The same way with this buried trauma. Once it's drained down to nothing, it's gone. And the person can feel it gone. They can feel their energy shift, and then you ask them when you're done, well, how do you feel about this kind of person now? And they go, I could care less about them. That trauma is gone. It's no longer affecting them. And it's a permanent cure. It's called the Mace Energy Method. And you can find more information about it on the causisminstitute.com. That's CAUSISM institute.com. And they have a write-up there about it and about John Mace.
Let's stop the episode here and continue this discussion. The next episode, I think we probably have a little bit over an hour. So I want folks to come back and hear the rest because we're still just getting started. So thank you, Jerry. It's an absolute pleasure.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's 2 options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site, and there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much and keep watching. I really appreciate it.